All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Alexa Tinsley. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Jet Foundation. Thank you all for joining our community webinar series on behaviors, anxiety, and stress management. We are very, very excited. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to hop on, so we'll be right back to introduce Natalie and Jessica, and then we will get this started. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I see we already have quite a few people on. Again, thank you all for joining us in our community webinar series. I'm again Alexa Tinsley, the Director of Community Engagement here at Jet Foundation. Today, our webinar is on behavior, anxiety, and stress management. We have Natalie Introduction from Nationwide Children's Hospital here, and our very own Ambassador Jessica Round with us as well. So thank you both for being here. We are very excited that this is our first topic for 2022. We know that it is definitely a topic of discussion and something that we really wanted to provide you guys education on. So we're very excited and happy that Natalie and Jessica are able to do this with us. Before we get started, I just want to mention a few things. If this is your first webinar series, we do offer these throughout the year on different topics. We have different education topics that we'll be presenting on. This webinar is being recorded, so if for any reason you lose connectivity or you have to hop off, you can go to our website later on and watch it as well, or if you just want to refer back to it, take some notes, you can watch it on the recorded version as well. I do know that we have a lot of families on our webinar today, so I just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of our ambassador program. We did have the application go out today, and we are looking to fill 30 of our ambassador positions for 2022. So we're inviting individuals, parents, grandparents, and siblings that are impacted by Duchenne to apply. Even if you're not interested in becoming an ambassador, if you're interested in connecting with one of our ambassadors, please feel free to reach out to me, and we will go ahead and connect you with one of them. The webinar today should take about 30 to 40 minutes, and then after we will be answering questions. There's a question box in your panel. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to drop them into the questions box and we'll answer them at the end. There is a chat function if you guys would like to talk to each other or just, put your thoughts in there, but questions that will be asked to Natalie and Jessica will be through the Q&A portion of the Zoom. So that's all from me. I will hand it over to Natalie and Jessica now for their presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Round, as they said. I'm a Jet ambassador for a few years, and I'm so excited to be able to talk to everybody about behaviors in Duchenne because this has been pretty much our biggest challenge so far. A little bit about me. I've been married to my husband, Patrick, for over 17 years. We have two sons, Wyatt, who has Duchenne, and Winston, who's 12, who does not have Duchenne. I started a blog to document this journey, and if you want to check it out, it's a pretty honest representation of life with a special needs child and all of the behaviors that have come with it and all of our struggles. Wyatt struggles with ADHD, impulsivity, anger, anxiety, a lot of what many of the boys with Duchenne have. So I just wanted to tell my story so everybody can kind of feel like you're not alone, because this has been a topic that not a lot of people haven't talked about or addressed. So it's a pretty lonely feeling, especially in the beginning when you're questioning, are you crazy? Is it your parenting style? What's happening with your child? So I like to say when Wyatt was born, he came out screaming, and he still screams all the time. He yells all the time. You can hear him. You can probably hear him in a little bit. When he was little, he would bang his head on his pack and play. He would get super angry. He had meltdowns and they would last for hours. And we'd put him in his room. We would try timeout. We tried everything. We pretty much just walked on eggshells around him. Friends and family didn't like to be around us, and they would give us their ways to, curb his behavior. And things like spanking him and all of those things, timeouts, it actually made it worse. And so after we tried as many things as we could think of, or all of the suggestions everybody would have, we did decide to finally take him to see a psychiatrist. And we got some good tips on how to help him. Um, Years later, we met Natalie Truba, Dr. Truba, and she gave us more strategies, which have definitely helped a lot more. When he was in first grade, we did decide to put him on some meds because we were at our wits' end. And honestly, we really didn't like Wyatt. We loved him, but we dreaded him getting off the school bus. It was terrible. It was hard. It was lonely. And so when we put him on the medicines to help with his anxiety and the ADHD and impulsivity, it was a game changer. We were happy again. He was happy. I can't even imagine what his little body was feeling like for all those years before it. So, though it has helped, I'm going to tell you, we still struggle. He still struggles. He is a freshman in high school, and I am still getting phone calls from school. I go and meet with the teachers and administration before school starts to prep them and tell them, like, this is how he is. These are the things that can help. We have a list. I even had Dr. Truba talk to the teachers one time, and they all pretty much still tell me, oh, he'll be fine. He's just like a normal third, fourth, fifth, whatever, freshman in high school. It's going to be fine. And I'm like, okay, well, good luck. And then 2, 3 weeks later into school, I get the, oh my God, this is terrible. He won't do this. He's yelling and all these things. And I pretty much say, I told you so, but I don't. So I go back to school and I bring all of the information back and tell them the best ways to deal with them. And so we've learned a lot of his quirks, and it seems to be a lot of things seen in a lot of Duchenne kids. Loud rooms, loud classrooms, even just the tapping of a pencil is extremely loud to him. This morning, he's like, what is that static noise? And it was literally his wheelchair charging. And I didn't even know it was making a noise. So I tell the teachers that to try to help so they can, if they know it's going to be a big, loud discussion, to prepare him for it. And so taking a break, things like that all help. But it's not perfect. But he also thrives on routine. If he knows exactly what's going to happen, then he's better. We've told them to give him a visual schedule at school, and they look at me like I'm crazy. He's in high school. Why does he need it? He's in a regular ed classroom. And then after they call me, I tell him to do it again, and it helps. If he has a checkbox, he knows what's coming next. I tell them if he's going to have a substitute, we need to know, because these things throw off the routine. And then you can talk to the administration and just keep him home. It's not worth the struggle sometimes. It's not worth the anxiety for him. And luckily, he knows that the end of the semester is this week, and he's already worrying about who his new teachers are, who are the new kids in the classroom. And so if you can take out the little parts that you know are going to be anxiety producing, it's much better for everyone. And then I really do, and I suggest telling the teachers their first impression of you is like the lasting impression. You walk into the classroom and I can just feel it. It's like immediate. My other son calls it his superpower. He like knows if you're going to be on his side or not. And if he gets that feeling, you're done. He will not try to repair your relationship with him. It's terrible. I try to like help mend it, but it's done. And so the teachers who have connected with him are like his greatest cheerleaders, and he will tell me to talk to them. So I just like to prepare them, even though maybe it's a struggle for them to do it, just to give them a little bit of guidance. So um, I know that's kind of a lot, and it's trying to get 15 years of what we've struggled with into a 5-10 minute talk is, difficult. But I just really want everyone to know that these behaviors are hard. It's difficult. It's lonely. It's hard to help a kid who is yelling at you because you didn't put the toothpaste on the toothbrush correctly, or the pillow just isn't right. And so there are strategies out there. And luckily, we have Dr. Truba, who is just brilliant in the hows and the whys of making it livable, because no one wants to not like their kid. And so, um, even though all of the things may not alleviate it, but it makes it better, and it makes people understand what you're going through. And instead of judging so quickly, you get a little more grace. So, as I said, I could go on and on. Jet Foundation has my email. Reach out, talk to me. I'm all over the Facebook groups. So, but hang in there, because it does get better. And Dr. Truba, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Jess, for sharing that. That was, I forgot that Wyatt is such a screamer, but I do remember that now. And I love my yellers. I don't know if anyone else has yeller kids, but hopefully we'll be able to make sense of a little bit of this for y'all, the remainder of this talk here. So let me just get my screen up and we'll get going. Does everyone see that? Okay, wonderful. I'm just looking at Jess because I can't see anybody else at this point. So, all right, so I'm Natalie. I'm a pediatric psychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital. So that means I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and then I have fellowship and residency training and working in a hospital. And my specialty is in rare diseases and in neuromuscular and complex care sort of presentations, which is how I stumbled into the joy that is getting to work with all of you and your boys and your manifesting girl carriers. So I don't know why there aren't more psychologists doing this, because this is such a great population. So hopefully we can get more people involved. And I'm happy to share other things outside of these talks. I could be kind of hard to email back and forth, but if you work with Jet, or if there's things that come up, we are happy here at Nationwide to be as helpful as we can if you don't get your care here. Okay, so my goals today are pretty broad. I hope to give you sort of an overview of how we understand dystrophinopathies to kind of affect physiological arousal and emotions, and sort of how that manifests for kids. Provide some basic strategies that kind of seem to be helping at home and school. And Jessica's right. Like, I will be the first one to tell you, our goal is never zero issues. We're going for less intense, less frequent, less long, like quicker recover times always, right? So when you have a dystrophinopathy, you have a neurodevelopmental condition, which means it's going to impact how your brain develops and therefore how your brain functions in comparison to other people's. And so that's a really important piece of Duchenne and Becker's that people are just now really kind of accepting that this is a neurodevelopmental condition. And so when I talk, I think it's helpful to know how people think. Otherwise, you're just drinking this Kool-Aid. You don't know where I'm coming from. So I am a behavioral psychologist, and so I see everything, thoughts, feelings, and physiology as behavior that we can watch, we can evaluate, we can bring under experimental control, and therefore we can change. And so when I talk about behavior, I'm talking about all of these things kind of simultaneously, interchangeably. And in this sense, it's really important that we have a good sense of the differences between those overt behaviors, those things we can see. So these are things that you guys, I can see your kid doing, and they're in clinic, and I'm like, oh no, I get they're a mover. They haven't sat down this whole time, right? Or they're yelling out, like just making noises, right? Or they're, flicking the lights or doing whatever it is they're doing to do them in clinic. Or the things that your teachers call you about, you're like, so-and-so just did this. So these are things we can see, right? The other part though is the covert, right? And this is how an individual perceives, responds, contacts environmental stimulus, things that happen that impact them at a hormonal level, at a physiological level, at a biological level, at a cellular level. that influences then why and how those other things, other bigger behaviors manifest. And these are things we can't see, things that happen, beneath the surface, that we have to have like really good language around to kind of describe to somebody else and make sense of. We have to have like really good body awareness and training to kind of be like, is this, does my stomach hurt because I'm hungry, or because I'm anxious, or because I'm, a little upset, or because it's loud in here? There's a lot of discrimination here in helping people understand what's going on internally that's making them act the way they're acting outside. And that's really important, because when we think about helping, we want to really make sure that we're not just thinking about the topography or what the behavior looks like, but the function of the behavior. And this is because all behavior is purposeful, even maladaptive behavior. So when you're looking at your kid and you're like, well, this makes no sense, why are you doing this? It's serving a function for them in some way, right? It might be a maladaptive function, but it's effective for some reason, or they wouldn't keep doing it, right? So like hitting sometimes for little kids, right? Like, you took my toy, like I hit you, you don't take my toy anymore. That's a maladaptive strategy. We don't want kids to hit, but it's effective, right? That kid's going to leave them alone. So, there's functions behind why these boys act the way they do, right? They're not malicious. They're not trying to be hard to manage. They're not trying to be bad. If anything, a lot of them will tell you, like, I don't know why I melted down. I don't know why I did that, right? They don't seem always in kind of control of themselves. And this is tricky because one behavior can serve multiple functions. So it's really important to have a good sense of like what's driving that, because we don't want to misinterpret, because if we go off what we're looking at in topography and we're wrong, we might actually make it worse, or we might get rid of a coping strategy that's actually helpful. And so crying is an example of a behavior that serves multiple functions. So we cry when we're sad, we cry when we're happy, we cry when we're stressed, we cry when we're overwhelmed, we cry when you hurt yourself. Those are all very different interventions, right? So if I'm crying because I broke my leg and you're treating me like I'm depressed, that's not going to go well. I'm going to be like, get the heck out of here. Like, what are you doing? Right? So we don't want to just look at somebody and assume they're depressed because they're crying. We want to know why you're crying, right? So that we can be helpful. And this is why for our kids in particular, and for other kids with really, more rare neurodevelopmental diseases, that is the DSM, or how we understand and how we make sense of behavioral dysfunction, isn't always the best fit. And in this sense, for a lot of our boys, they do present much more like disordered-like than full-blown disorder. And this is because as humans, there's only so many ways that we can manifest overt behaviors, right? To reflect what's going on internally, which is why we can cry, but we cry for all sorts of reasons, right? So we have a more limited set of how we can express ourselves than what we can experience, right? So some of those are going to kind of be used to do more than one thing. And then on top of all that, we have what makes us who we are, right? So some of you might know punishment and reinforcement sensitivity is more like personality. Personality is not fixed. What we know is that changes over time. It changes in relation to our environment and who are around. And so what really is happening a lot of times is it's a really fancy way of saying it's just things you like and you don't like, right? There are physiological processes some of us like and some of us don't like. I thrive off attention. I like attention. So I, do talks like this. I have a job where I'm with people, and I like to play sports, and I like to do things that bring me attention. My brother, not as much. He does not like it. So that doesn't mean that getting attention is different for us, right? The process of getting attention, like you're aware that people are watching you, like that's the same. I just like how that feels, and he doesn't. So he does less of it and I do more of it, right? But the attention process isn't different. It's just whether we like that or not. And that then shapes kind of other bigger sets of behavior. So there are boys in this group, right, that actually thrive in some of this like higher kind of heightened state that we're going to talk about. There's not many of them, and I call them my Goldilocks boys. So if you are a parent of one of those boys, make sure you bring that up in the question so I can tell you a few more specific, unique things to your kiddos, because they need things just right. That's why we call them the Goldilocks boys. But for most boys, right, we can get them to a place that they feel better, and we're not maybe as heightened or experiencing the world in a way that is not a good fit. And so the first things that we need to be aware of is just the fact that the amount of mental health concerns that our boys are diagnosed with is astronomically higher than what we would expect given what the rates are in the normative population. So this should just tell everybody something's going on here that makes these kids much more likely or much more vulnerable to qualifying for some sort of diagnosis, right? more likely an externalizing diagnosis, right? Like ADHD, anxiety, ODD, OCD, those things that kind of like mean you're like kicked up and like just really like too much energy to a degree. We see less like depression, for example, than you might think. What that looks like in clinic, though, is a little different. And this is why they present with a lot more disorder-like behavior, because they don't always meet all the criteria, right? And you'll see that common when parents are like, well, we had this autism assessment and they have like these pieces, but like not these pieces, so they didn't qualify. That doesn't mean, though, the things that would be helpful aren't still helpful, right? And so that's the tricky part with our boys, is that they're just unique compared to what people know. And then you go to school and you're like, oh, they have these diagnoses. You're like, we got it. We have kids, like all sorts of kids with those diagnoses. You're like, yeah, but do they have Duchenne? Because this is like Duchenne induced, right? Because if we didn't have Duchenne, we probably wouldn't have, the ADHD, right, or the anxiety. So it's just really important to keep that in mind. And this is why we see these things in clinic, like these learning difficulties, that it's hard for them to generalize information to new environments. Difficulties with executive control functions, like suppressing background noise and attention, right? So attention is really important. If you can't attend to what you want when you want and sustain it, it's hard to learn, it's hard to calm down, it's hard to enjoy things, the world feels very chaotic. They have unique information processing and memory recall abilities. I don't like when people say they have bad memory recall abilities, because they do not. They struggle with memory and recall in certain situations or settings that we should say, like, yeah, we expect them to have a harder time learning there, like school, actually. You could be one of those parents like, my kid will not remember this math procedure they've learned. And like, we literally practice that stuff for like 10 hours a day. They still struggle, but like, we'll be driving around, be like, hey, remember that time, April 17th at 2 p.m. when the sun was in retrograde Jupiter and this happened? And you're like, what are you talking about? And they'll lay out the whole thing, like perfect memory. So they can remember when the situation is in a place that they're optimized to make good memories, right? And be able to form good memories and then pull on them later. So they don't have bad memories, right? So I want to make sure that we're being mindful of that, because there's a lot of that talk that goes on, like, oh, they can't remember. That's not true, right? But it's harder for them to remember in certain environments. A lot of sleep difficulties and difficulties winding down to bed, which if you don't have Duchenne and you have no medical conditions and you are not sleeping, you're going to have a lot of problems. So incredibly important. Sleep is incredibly important. They have a lot of low tolerance for distressing things, or they just like get overwhelmed very easily. They have a hard time transitioning, or when there's just changes in those routines, or they're expecting this and then this happens, like they tend to do less well with that. They have what I affectionately call rage-like meltdowns, which we can see that seem kind of out of the blue, or something small, like their brother like moved their pencil from like this angle to this angle, and now they're like having a full-on meltdown. You're like, okay, that seems a little disproportionate. We see higher rates of selective mutism than you would predict in the normative neurotypical population. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We see a lot of hyperfocus, a fair amount of perseveration, or getting stuck or in those thought loops where they're kind of like, but when are we going to grandma's? You're like, we're going to grandma's next Tuesday at 10. And they're like, when are we going to grandma's? And you just keep telling them, and they keep asking. And you're like, oh my gosh, like I've literally told you 100 times. Like, I know when we're going to grandma's. Like, why do you keep asking me? And we see that OCD like behavior, like ordering, aligning, wanting things very particular. And so the literature, the scientific community, I mean, what it's really looking like is there really is some impact of dystrophin on the brain-body interaction from a regulatory sense, and that physiological ability to regulate. So the brain's ability to regulate in relation to the body's body, how that feedback is getting sent and redistributed, and their individual capacity and abilities to self-soothe and tolerate and sit with and tolerate that process. Those are the kind of two important pieces. And when we're talking about regulation, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system mostly. There are other processes that go into regulation, but for the scope of what you need to know, this is probably the most important, is that the autonomic nervous system gets a little out of whack. And this is our system that controls our autonomic involuntary body processes that involve smooth glands and muscles. There's two systems. The one is the sympathetic. This is our fight or flight or mobilizing system. This is the system that is dominant during periods of stress. When this system gets activated, there are hormones that are released, epinephrine and norepinephrine, pretty quickly that do a bunch of things. They increase respiration, so they increase your heart rate, how fast you're breathing. They increase your blood pressure, right? So your vascular system constricts, our blood pressure increases, and our blood tends to kind of get redistributed to our important parts of our body. And there's decreases in our processes of elimination and digestion, right? And so those things slow because those are less vital organs. That blood gets pooled over more into our heart and our lungs and other areas, so we can get ready to fight, flight, or run. And so those are all things that with our boys that are problems that we want to make sure we're not making worse. And then the parasympathetic system is the shutdown system, or the calming system, the relaxation system. And this system is dominant during periods of rest and relaxation. And it's healthier for you as a human to have a more dominant parasympathetic system than a sympathetic system. And this is physically, it's a lot healthier for you to have a more dominant, but cognitively, it also is healthier because dysfunction in this regulatory process negatively impacts executive functioning. So that subsequently impacts our ability to learn, to attend, to self-regulate, to do all the things that kind of make us humans that other people like and can tolerate, and don't want to like excommunicate to an island because nobody can handle you, right? So it's important from a brain functioning and learning standpoint, as well as from a physical functioning cardiovascular protection standpoint. What this looks like. So I use a lot of biofeedback equipment when I work with guys, more little kids, because this process does change as they age. And so we can talk about that later too. But this is a box I use a lot. This is a visual representation of our regulatory system. On the left, you can see parasympathetic is anything that is going up, and our sympathetic system is that shutdown. We have the time across the bottom there, and then the window itself is what we'd call window of tolerance. And so things that make our windows really big are things like getting good sleep and having food and being safe and not having pain. And things that make our window small are the opposite of those, right? So being an unsafe environment, not sleeping well, being unhealthy. And we want big windows because if something happens and we have a big swing or we are less okay, we have we have a bigger capacity to tolerate that, right? So when we have little windows bad, we want big windows. So I have computer equipment that lets me look at different physiological processes that are indicators of stress. And when I hook these kids up, we have some really interesting patterns. And so if you are a parent and you are not a carrier, and you will notice, you will have a physiological pattern that hopefully, unless you are very anxious and have a lot of panic attacks or have your own medical conditions, looks something like this. This is a really regulated pattern, and you see there's ups, there's downs. You're not going to notice this because you're not swinging really high, you're not swinging really low. You're walking, your body's activated, you're thinking, your body's activated, you sit down, your body goes into rest, and all is good. I am not an anxious person, but I am a hyper person. I have a lot of energy, and I walk to work. So if I'm walking to work and I must get by car, I might have a physiological swing like this. And I'm going to notice this because I'm getting to the top of my window. Okay. So I might be was happy and calm walking, and then all of a sudden I'm skipped by his car. I'm going to have a startle response. I might notice my body gets hot. I might notice my breathing changes. I might notice I'm all of a sudden kind of mad, and I wasn't mad because I was just listening to my book and tape and I was just getting ready to come to work. And now I'm like yelling at somebody. But I'm going to shut down quick. So my body's gonna be like, I'm okay. And probably within the next couple of minutes, I'm going to go back to listen to my book and not be thinking about it. And I'll get to my office and I'll feel fine. If you are anxious, your body learns actually how to hold that longer. So the more that your body stays heightened, the more it will stay heightened because it's learning to do that, right? So we don't necessarily want to stay heightened for a long time, right? Because we get good at staying heightened then when we stay heightened for a long time. And this becomes important for our kiddos because the pattern I see for them in my carrier moms, so if you're a mom and you're a carrier, this applies to you, is something that looks more like this. And this is an insidious process that happens throughout the day. It happens over the course of days, right? It can, they don't always fully recover at night. And so you might start off at a higher state. This is something that because it happens very slow, you are not aware of, right? And so it can happen slow. It creeps up on them. They're not aware of it. And they don't shut down naturally like we do. They try, right? So we see them trying to, but for some reason they kick back up. I mean, I have thoughts and I'm going to tell you why that is. But this is the process I've seen with literally every single kid I've done this with that has Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy. I am sure there's kids out there that don't fit this. I haven't met them yet. But I see this with my moms too, right? And that's important because if you're a mom and you are sensitive as well, then instances where you're like trying to put your kid to bed and they're like throwing up fit, even if you're keeping it cool, if your body is really reactive, they're going to feed off that. And now it's even harder to put them to bed, right? And so knowing that about yourself is important, so that sometimes it's like you just got to tag out because it's a physiological, not a good match, right? What we think is happening is there's several isoforms of dystrophin that we are known are found in the brain and are prevalent in the brain, particularly throughout fetal development and early development, all the way throughout the lifespan. And what it seems to be happening is there's a lot of that going on in the brain that is impacting regulatory processes at a neuronal communication level, and their brains seem very overactive, and as if they're not kind of like suppressing or getting used to stimulus, and they're kind of always responding and turning on and flooding itself with these excitatory neurotransmitters, right? So their brain's kind of hijacked in that sense. That's kind of how I think about it, right? And then you have their muscles. So the brain being hijacked kind of kicks them up. So they're overreactive to all these, it's stimulus in the environment. And then because of how their muscles are impacted, it interrupts that natural parasympathetic process. So their body tries to shut down, but then their breathing is all wonky and it kicks them back up, right? And that's because when we're breathing, we're using all of these muscles. And what we see is that even in my little bitties, right, like my 4 or 5-year-olds, we do see some, like, not weakness per se in their breathing muscles, but we see that it's harder for them to breathe really smoothly or to breathe really deep or to do that. Like if there is an added demand on them, it's harder. And so when they're at rest, they tend to have, over time, they develop these kind of choppy chest style of breathing. That is an anxious style of breathing, but they're not anxious, but their brain doesn't know that. So their brain is like, oh, shoot, something's going on. Because that's a breathing pattern that tells me that I got to do all the things, because that's how our brains work. So that breathing pattern, short, choppy breaths, is actually what triggers our brain to go into fight and flight state and for the most part. And so that's a really important process. And that's why some of these strategies are really focused on regulating the environment so these natural processes can kind of do their thing. And over time, what happens is they develop these chronic physiological patterns that make that window very small. It makes them very vulnerable to misperceiving threats. So misperceive neutral things and misperceive even positive things as potential threats. So when your kids escalate and you're like, hey, I'm going to take your iPad if you do that again, and then they get worse, that's why, right? Because now they're freaking out because they're like already panicked, and then now you threaten them. It's not a real threat, but like when your brain is hijacked, that is not how you perceive it, right? Now it's like, they're like, I'm going to die because you took my iPad. And you're like, oh my gosh, wow, you're like addicted to this iPad. So hopefully that's an important context, because those big responses, right, are not something they're doing on purpose. And that's important just to get out there. And then what happens, because they feel kind of really overwhelmed all the time, is they start to do some weird things to make themselves feel better. Like they order and they align and they like things very particular, and they might do things like yell, right? Because they feel better after they yell. And those are things that actually like are signs. Those are our canaries in the coal mine. Like, if I'm starting to get super overwhelmed, I feel really kicked up. So sometimes we don't actually want to get rid of those, because that's like what tells us, hey, like I'm not okay. And that's why we have to train them. Like, when you do this means you need a break, because that's kind of how they have to learn to listen to their body. And this is what develops into their behavioral phenotype, in addition to like who they are as an individual, you know, their personality, family dynamics, and then how you parent, right? So those other things are important too. And then we put them on steroids, right? So we got all this going on, and then they're on steroids, which they have to take, right? And so it's not, you know, like anybody that's trying to make it sound to you like parenting your kid is going to be easy, or you're just not doing it right, like is on a crazy train, because it's just a hard thing to do, right? Like you're already uphill battle. And so this is why they present super physiologically overwhelmed, right? They're super sensitive. Their learning is impacted, and they don't shut down. And what happens is over time, their heart rate variability is impacted. And so what we see in our boys is they have poor or low heart rate variability. We want high heart rate variability, because what we want is our hearts and our bodies to respond based on the environment and the context. So if we're in a stressful environment, we want our body to be, our heart rate up. We want stress stuff to be going on. If we're in a calm environment, we want our body to be calm. What we see with our boys is they don't change. They're just always responding as if things are stressful. right? So there's never a reprieve and a break on that cardiovascular system and that heart and those chemicals being flooded, okay? And then they don't have the outlets that other kids would have like that to kind of burn that energy off, right? Because that is not something that we permit them to do and is safe for them to do often. They can more so do it when they're little, but they still fatigue, and then they fatigue, and then they're grumpy, right? So it's a balance, right? And the trick is when they're here, what we're seeing, what happens is minor things, right, now produce a huge physiological response. And then because they have diminished vagal response, because that system is depleted or minimized, they don't fully recover. And now over time, their window just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they start to look like this, right? And now it's like they just get up and they're just getting ready for the bus and they're melting down. And you're like, what? You just woke up. Like, I don't know where we went wrong today. And so it's challenging. So if we step back and we think, whoa, these are all the things that we come in and we say, like, but we know this other thing about the brain and the body, we can probably start to say, well, yeah, if that's going on, we would expect to see these things, right? Like that's what happens to you from a learning standpoint and a brain standpoint when that's happening, right? We know that from people with a lot of trauma. We know that from people that have really overwhelming stress experiences, that these processes are interrupted. We know that it would be harder to sleep then, right? And we also know that if you're not sleeping, all of these things are likely to occur anyway. We would expect behaviorally for these things to start happening, right? Like when you are heightened and when your brain is hijacked and when you lived at a heightened physiological state, yeah, you're going to be real jumpy. You're going to have a harder time like tolerating things that you're not expecting. If any of you have ever been under a ton of stress and you're like, I don't know, like working and your kids, and then you have to like study for an exam or you have to like do something. And then, you just want your house how you want it. You just want your space how you want it. I just like want my stuff how I want it, right? Because you just feel better because everything is stress and that is just something that makes you feel better. And they are like that too. And so that's just being a human, right? And so we would expect to see that. We would expect to see these as coping or compensatory strategies, right? Like the world is loud. I can't ever shut anything off. So it's an all or nothing. I'm getting all of it or I'm getting just this one thing, right? That is actually an adaptive strategy that helps. We see a lot with ADHD and autism, right? I'm all or nothing, right? Perseveration, if you are super kicked up and heightened, it's hard for you to shift your attention off things. So they get stuck in those thoughts, right? And they can't shift off of that. OCD, like I said, coping behaviors, right? So they're doing these things to help themselves soothe. And so what we want to do is we want to start to move from here, right? So this is where we usually start to catch kids because kids, like they're being good, so we leave them alone and then they do something. We're like, hey, don't do that again. And then we like go back and we're like, they need to regulate because I just told them not to do that thing. And then they do this and then we're like, what the heck? And then we do it again. And now we've already missed the window because by the time we see the first sign, you're already too late because now we're already out of the window because they're too heightened, right? So now you're asking a kid who can't really do this really well to now like play in the Super Bowl, right? And they just started playing Pee Wee football, okay? So we want to catch them here, which means we have to be very intentional and proactive, and we want to start to move from a reactive management to a proactive. And reactive management isn't bad. It is a very normal adaptive way of parenting. It just doesn't work as well for these kids, right? It's actually the way to actually, for most kids, how they need to learn this, right? Like you do something, I yell at you, or you're going to lose something, and you are now putting the effort into avoiding that consequence, right? But for these boys, because they're so heightened, right, that doesn't help. And then what happens if we take that approach is they don't learn from those consequences, right? Because that learning process is interrupted. So you're like, dude, every time you do this happens and you're still doing it. It's like, well, it's not working then. They're not learning from that consequence. We need to implement that different. Important to remember the rule of 2-ish year delay. So I say 2-ish because it does look like that. But so this is a mismatch, and this is not delay cognitively. So your kid, if they're 10, is like capable of being a 10-year-old. They're like doing math at a 10-year-old level, et cetera, et cetera. However, they might only be frontal lobe development, regulatory wise, at around 8, right? 7.5, 8. So that's a mismatch. Now we have different expectations for 10-year-olds than we do 7.5, 8-year-olds, right? So if we're expecting someone to function here and they're here, that's a big gap, right? And so what we see is over time, these kids, they do tend to do better. They kind of grow out of some of these behaviors. They tend to calm down a bit, right? As they get older in those teen years, which is awesome, right? But until then, right, it's important that the schools and are aware of the fact that like there's going to be a mismatch. You might notice that that's part of this condition, and there's things that you can do to kind of help them bolster those skills as they're, you know, catching up a bit. The environment, including people, are stimulus. So not our environments are created equal. School is incredibly overwhelming. There's sounds, sights, noises, like kids jumping out at you, like, you know. So this is where you see that selective mutism sometimes. So selective mutism is a freeze response, right? So I get overwhelmed and now I'm not talking, right? We would not do exposure to treat that like you would for another kid, because we know that would make it worse. What we do is we calm them down, and now they do a lot better with talking to kids at school. And this plays out where families will say like, yeah, they're super excited with school. We get to school, their friend Johnny says hi to them, and they just like freeze and don't say anything the rest of the day, right? Even though they're really excited about going to school initially, right? And so, you know, it's just those patterns that you might pick up, like they do great at grandma's. Well, it's a one-on-one to grandma. It's like quiet there. There's nobody there, of course. Like they're going to thrive in that environment. That's like great, right? So that makes sense, right? It's not anything you're doing wrong, right? That's just grandma's house is really calm. Stimulation is stimulation, right? So aversive and exciting experiences are the same. So if you're riding a roller coaster, that excitement process is going to be the same as if you're getting your iPad taken away at the end of the day, right? So it's important that if you're doing a bunch of fun stuff all day, and then all of a sudden those fun stuff stop, and there's no transition, and there was no regulating that throughout the day. Now you have a kid who's super aroused. They had a great day though, and now that's quickly going to turn negative, right? Because now we have all this arousal and no party to go to. So even with fun things, these strategies are really important to implement. And the things that we're finding are working are really that trigger management, antecedent management, staying ahead of things. And so it's developing those procedures we know work to avoid furthering escalation, to interrupt processes of escalation as early in that chain as possible to identify. So this is where we start to identify, like, this is what my kid is doing, that I can start to say like, ooh, we're starting to do that thing way before we get to the point that you're actually doing things that you're in trouble for, right? So that's really important place for like an aide at school to jump in and, you know, advocate for an aide, because you know, just like we would have an aide to help us grab something physical, you know, high or heavy, right? We might need somebody to help us with the heavy lifting emotionally, right? Like, okay, hey, your buddy, you're doing that thing. We need to go for a break. Do you know you're doing that? So that they can learn this in real time, because that is how they learn this, is proactively and earlier in that chain of escalation. The best thing we started doing with families was scheduled breaks. I'll be the first one to tell you, like when we started, I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know what else to try. Like, let's just try some of these things, right? I think, Jessica, you guys are one of the first people we started doing this with. We're like, let's just try it and see if we can get ahead of this. And it works really well for a lot of people. There's a lot of guys that like, we just start scheduled breaks at school and like, we don't have these issues anymore. And those breaks are important because they allow for activity pacing, but they're also opportunities for reducing arousal, right? So getting that stimulation, getting them out of that environment, putting them in a space where they can kind of like have like a little coping corner. And over time, what happens is they regulate a lot faster, they shut down. And what we're doing is we're just forcing that shutdown throughout the day. So we know they're going to climb, we just force it to happen. We know they're going to climb, we force it to happen. And that's why we do those scheduled breaks. So 24/7, 365, I don't care if you're at the zoo, I don't care if it's Christmas, I don't care if it's your grandma's funeral. It is what it is, right? Like if your kid needs a break every 2 hours, they need a break every 2 hours. If they need a break every, 6 hours, they need a break if they need a break every half hour, it is what it is. And it's important that the school just get on board with that, because then you have less issues at home, you have less issues on the weekend. You like your kid when they get home because they're not exhausted and depleted because they've just been trying to keep it together all day at school because they don't want to get in trouble, even though they're not always great at it. I love token economies because they help naturally shift to a proactive management approach. They have a lot of continuity across home and school and other environments. So it kind of can get all the caregivers on the same page, which can be really hard on these kids when they're not. And if you have other kids, it allows you to target other things. So it's fair, right? And they can do that in the classroom as well. And every school has psychologists or behavioral health providers. So they're equipped to help develop this within the school setting that you can then generalize to your home, right? Or take parts of it that you want and generalize that to the home. For the kiddos, what we have found is training deep breathing does not help. And so what seems helpful is sort of more controlled chest breathing to help regulate that choppy chest breathing versus trying to have them do something that actually makes it worse. So if you're even with the school, like if you're at a school where they do mindfulness breathing and that kind of stuff, just telling them like, hey, he doesn't do deep breathing, he does like rhythmic breathing. Like we work on rhythmic chest breathing. They need a lot of direct instruction in this. And so it is helpful to advocate for a one-to-one aid at school. And the schools will push back on you in this. And I'm, happy. I love fighting with schools. It helps. So if they don't want to have these issues, then we just say like, well, this will fix it. If you don't have these issues, like quit calling me. I'm telling you what to do to fix this thing. Because it does help tremendously. And the school needs to intentionally practice, right? So times that they can build this in is like when the kids are happy or excited, like we're transitioning from recess back into the classroom, or we're at recess and like we just like, we're like, hey, I'm gonna use Wyatt because I see Jessica like, hey Wyatt, like how you doing today? Like you're running around, like stand here for a second, like talk to me, like let's check in and regulate. Those are all periods for these boys to practice, like stopping, doing things like letting their bodies rest that they can do at school pretty easily, even between class. Or there's all sorts of ways that the schools can build this in. And I'm telling you, if you can get on a good plan at school, your lives at home are much easier and you don't have to do as much. And so the school is a great environment to get a lot of these in. All right. And with that, I will end. I went kind of over. I apologize about that. But yeah, we are happy to take questions that we can hopefully answer.
I'm on mute. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Natalie and Jessica. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Hopefully it answered some questions for our families out there. If you do have questions, please pop them in to that Q&A box in the panel. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please try to keep them general. Natalie and Jessica aren't really able to answer specific questions about your child, but we would love to hear general questions that they might be able to answer. So we'll give it a few minutes to see if we have any questions for them. Jess, do you want to add anything while we're getting some of those questions?
I do want to say, I mean, if you can get them on board with trying to do that schedule break, unfortunately, Wyatt now doesn't like to leave the classroom because he feels like he's going to miss something. But he had a big blow up the other day. I'm like, dude, when you just felt it, you need to look at your aide. And I think sometimes the aide doesn't really want to pull them. So it's almost like finding that nice balance of, it's okay, somebody will have the notes, and just for, just a little, it's okay to do it, and we have to do it. It's written in the IEP, do it kind of thing.
Absolutely. So we do have one question. Well, we have two. So the first one is, coming from a non-parent, how do I introduce new experiences that are upcoming, fun, exciting, knowing that overwhelm is very prevalent when new things are being introduced?
That's a great question. So I will always preface everything with, it depends on the kid. And so my recommendation would be to just, if you can, like talk to the parent about like how the kiddo is and what kind of approach. There are kids that like actually with too much prep do worse. And so if you have a kiddo that as long as they're not surprised, they can kind of ease themselves into it, then I would start that prep early enough that it's not like months away, because that could be hard from an abstract standpoint, but just kind of like, hey, this is happening. And then what would we do, right, if we notice this, or if this happened, and start to like rehearse that. And then the day of, like, hey, we're doing this. Remember, what are we going to do if this happens, or if we feel this when we're doing this thing, right? And so you guys kind of have a plan, and that actually works a lot better for a lot of the boys. If they're thinking about what they're going to do beforehand, they don't have that freeze, like, I don't know what to do, panic, shut down. So usually prepping them for that kind of stuff goes pretty well.
I agree. I think the prepping has definitely worked for us, and having a planned like escape, or like know the time. The party's at 7 and say the latest we're leaving is 8:30. Like we know that's about your max normally, and watch for he's about to shut down, because if you don't have your escape plan ready, it's really hard to leave a party that you have been like waiting for yourself. So I think even prepping yourself and knowing that's the time and everybody's on the same page helps.
Thank you. There is a question. There's someone whose child has DMD and ADHD. He doesn't wear clothes at home. He's 8 with no steroids, and he also has speech issues. So is that normal? What does that kind of look like?
I'm not surprised that he doesn't love clothes. That's a real sensory, and there are a lot of these boys that are very tactilely sensitive. I don't know if there are any fabrics or materials that he can tolerate, or I would be mindful, like, if he does tolerate clothing at school, like, he's probably not like feeling great. He's probably very aware that he has clothes on, so like that's going to impact attention and learning and just feeling calm. I would probably recommend for you, if you haven't already had the recommendation or done it, like a neurodevelopmental eval or a neuropsych eval to kind of elucidate maybe where there could be some remediation to help with those language delays and to help with some tactile work at school. So like even sensory therapy, like with OTs and that, just to get used to different fabrics, could be helpful for a kiddo like that. Knowing though that he probably does feel very overwhelmed when wearing clothes. So when he has clothes on, he's probably like less his best self, I would guess. And just helping the school know that. I mean, not that we want him to, be naked at school, but they should know too, like, hey, like he's having a hard day. He did not sleep, XYZ, there's a sub and he's got clothes on. So he is not going to be his best self, right? So, like, just so they know too, like it's all of those factors for our kids. It's like, imagine if you hate the sound of like scratching nails on a chalkboard and it was just like constant and you just had to try to learn what that happened. You'd be like, well, I'm not doing that. Right. And that's maybe how clothes feel. So helping the schools and that understand that, like, we know enough about the brain to say, like, I don't know if these kids experience things like we do, but I've met enough that will say, like, this sound hurts and I feel like they mean it. And so I can't tell them that a sound doesn't hurt. And I've had sounds that hurt me. I'm like, I don't like this. It hurts. So I think we just have to believe them and say, like, okay, this is something you don't like, and we can help them desensitize to it. Right. But knowing that when that's happening and they're doing it, they're probably feeling less than ideal.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
She did clarify that he does wear clothes at school, just so you know. Any other questions from anybody?
And if he keeps it together at school, you should be super proud of him, because that has got to be exhausting. And I would not be surprised if he does keep it together at school, if he gets home and you're like, why? Why is this happening?
And we do know that some people, sorry, Jess, if you have a question and you, for some reason, just, can't formulate it right now, or you got to think about it a little bit, you can feel free to reach out to me and I'll get it to Natalie and Jessica after this, and we'll try to get questions answered. Again, it'll be difficult if they're specific, but if they're general, we'll do our best. So just go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no. Dr. Truba had mentioned a neuropsych eval, and I highly recommend getting one of those, because it definitely kind of tells you where they struggle a lot, and to be able to, the school loves to have data. And so to be able to give that to the school to say, look, here's where he struggles, and here are some things, that are seen in this actual testing. I feel like that's helpful, just to come from the parent side and the school side.
Perfect. And then do these behaviors usually start at a certain age?
That's a good question. I'm going to say no. I have met families that will say, like, they came out and did not tolerate this, right? And they're like, this has been the same. I have other families that say, like, kind of, but like it got worse, right, as they got older or as they evolved. So I can't, that's a hard one to answer. I can tell you though, with more definitive optimism and comfort, that they do get better as they age. And as they get older, it does seem, we have some working hypotheses about why this is, but they do seem physiologically a little bit more blunted as they age. So they don't have as big as swings. So we don't see as like the chaotic labileness of emotions that we see when they're younger.
Yeah. And I think maybe you see it and it's manageable. And then when we add steroids to it, then you're like, oh my God, where did this kid come from? And they were probably there. It just totally amplified it. So,
but usually those, I would say, Jessica, would you say too, like those, like the sensory sensitivities for the kids, like a lot of them, those are present usually young. Like if they don't like certain sounds, like they don't ever like them, or certain lights, or certain being held certain ways, or certain fabrics, or that kind of stuff. Yep. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, well, I think that's all we have. Thank you to Dr. Truba and Jessica for doing this. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here and for joining us today. If you have any other questions, like I said, or if you have any suggestions on topics or what you'd like to see in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you, Rama, for joining from India. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone. So we hope you return in the future, and we appreciate all of you.
Bye.